Good morning. Today's theme is forgiveness, and so we're going to do a meditation based on that. So if you'd get comfortable in your seats and get as relaxed as you can, gently close your eyes. Sure. Thank you. And breathe in deeply and exhale slowly. Do this a few more times. And as you do this, imagine yourself in a situation in which you were hurt or offended or humiliated by another person. A person who might be the object of your forgiveness. Could be a friend, a neighbor, or a member of your family. No matter what the offense or how long ago it happened, you can still feel the hurt and the anger that goes with it. Now, in your mind's eye, picture that hurt like a large red ball, pulsating with the heat of anger. Feel that anger as you see that pulsating red ball. Now see that ball gradually stop pulsating. It's beginning to change color. First a deep purple, then a cool, soothing cobalt. As the color changes, see the ball moving away and getting smaller. As that ball moves away, gradually, you feel the hurt dissipating from your body, and the anger begins to subside. The ball continues to move further and further away until you can barely see it. The hurt gradually disappears, and so does the anger toward the person responsible for it. You feel more content, more peaceful. Imprint this feeling on your mind and remember that forgiveness can feel good. And you can do this many, many times over. The reading for today comes from this book called Forgiving and Reconciling by Everett Worthington. He is a professor of psychology at Virginia Commonwealth University, and he has studied forgiveness for over 30 years anyway. He is the executive director of the Templeton Foundation's campaign for forgiveness research. The Templeton prize is always given to a person who sort of combines faith and science. His forgiveness skills were severely tested several years ago when his mother was severely beaten and killed by a burglar. Chances are you have experienced transgressions against you. They have come from well-meaning helpers, parents who are sure they know what's good for you, oblivious friends, stressed-out caretakers, children who disappoint, bosses who have their own agenda, or simply people with a mean streak. Humans get hurt and offended. That is part of being human. Chances are also high that at least with one of those transgressions, you still worry it around your neck like a piece of chomped-on skin inside your cheek. Perhaps you sometimes catch the bitterness in your tone of voice. Maybe you have taken petty revenge and hate yourself for it. Perhaps you plot revenge on a larger scale, while at the same time you don't like the way your mind is working. Perhaps the problem occurred in the past. Maybe you are divorced and cannot get beyond the resentment. Maybe your father died without giving you a chance to make things right with him. You want to forgive. You need to forgive. Perhaps you're in an ongoing relationship that has gone sour, at home, at work, or with a romantic partner. You have invested in that relationship and you don't want to give it up. You want to reconcile, but how? Forgiveness and reconciliation are not simple. They require courage, commitment, and conscious effort. But if you are willing, there are great relational treasures to be given, and sometimes even received, when you forgive and try to reconcile. Nelson Mandela had a lot of wonderful qualities. One was courage, certainly, to stand up for his rights, even in the face of prison. Another was tenacity, able to survive 27 years in prison while keeping his humanity. Also, boundless optimism, believing all through those 27 years that South Africa was going to be a free democratic country, particularly for the 80% blacks who were subjugated under apartheid. But the quality I admire most about Nelson Mandela is his ability to forgive. As I'd read earlier, forgiveness is not easy, which is probably why we admire it so much in leaders of peace like Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Dalai Lama, Aung San Suu Kyi. Like most Americans, I was appalled at the prospect of apartheid and glad to see that Nelson Mandela had been freed. But beyond that, I hadn't thought much about South Africa or Mandela until my wife and I were invited to South Africa as guests of the South African wine industry. I used to be a food and wine writer, as some of you may know. And after the hard work of tasting lots of wines and eating a lot of good food and seeing the beautiful wine country of South Africa, we decided to take a break and do a little tourist stuff. And one of the things we did was to visit Robben Island, which is where Mandela spent 18 of his 27 years. Robben Island is a lot like Alcatraz, if you've ever been to Alcatraz, off the coast of a major city, in this case, Cape Town. A bleak rock of an island. As a matter of fact, they call Alcatraz the rock. Surrounded by treacherous waters, reserved for only the worst of the worst criminals. And in both cases, Alcatraz and Robben Island are now museums, and the tours at Robben Island are given by former inmates. And on this tour, of course, the highlight was the cell in which Mandela spent his 18 years, about the size of a closet, with a mat on the floor, not really a bed, a bucket as a toilet. But that really wasn't the total extent of his imprisonment. He was also sentenced to hard labor. And you have to remember that Mandela was not a young man when he was put in prison. He was in his 40s, didn't get out until he was in his 70s. And as if that were not enough, he could only receive one visitor a year for 30 minutes. He could only send out one letter and receive one letter every 6 months. Mandela was treated like, well, worse than most murderers in this country. But his crime was wanting the people of South Africa to be free and for South Africa to be a democracy. Now, most people in this kind of a situation, once they were released, might fall into one of two categories. Either they be broken and defeated as a human being and just not able to continue as they were before, or they might be filled with anger and hatred and bitterness and seek vengeance on those who perpetrated these crimes on him, and certainly in Mandela's case on the people of South Africa. But Mandela didn't fit into either of these categories. Instead, he went to F.W. de Klerk, who was then the head of the apartheid government in South Africa. And he said, F.W., that's what his friends called him, F.W., South Africa is going to be free and democratic at some point in the future. Why don't you and I work together to make that happen as peacefully and as smoothly as possible? And fortunately, de Klerk agreed. And the two worked together for the next 3 or 4 years to bring about free elections. And for their efforts, they shared the Nobel Peace Prize. Mandela, of course, was elected president in 1994. And people in that situation might say, okay, now I've got the power. Now I can exact revenge on those people. Now I can prosecute all those people who were responsible for the brutalities, and there were quite a few of them, of apartheid. But he didn't do that either. Instead, he set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was headed by Bishop Desmond Tutu. And this commission said to the victims of apartheid, come and tell your story. And it also said to the victimizers of apartheid, come and tell your story, and we'll give you an opportunity for amnesty. So the result of this was that South Africa went from a repressive, brutal government to a democracy without a civil war and with minimal bloodshed. Now, if you contrast that to their neighbor, Zimbabwe, which is ruled by a person who had very similar backgrounds to Mandela. He was arrested as a political prisoner. But he had become more and more repressive himself as Zimbabwe's leader, not much different in many ways from the apartheid government of South Africa. When I'm faced with a situation in which forgiveness is called for, and I'm thinking in particular of friends of mine, long-time friends, who I had and still have a hard time forgiving for voting for George Bush twice. I sometimes say to myself, what would Mandela do in a situation like this? Of course, he'd probably laugh and say, what? You can't forgive them? I was in prison for 27 years. You know those bracelets that evangelicals used to wear? It would say, what would Jesus do? WWJD. Well, I have a bracelet that says WWMD. It has nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction, but it does mean, what would Mandela do in a situation like that? Now, it's unlikely that most of the things that you and I would consider for forgiveness would be anything near what Mandela was faced with. Most of the time, they're relatively minor, maybe a friend who didn't repay a loan, or somebody who caused an injury, let's say an auto accident that was their fault and created some hurt to you or your family. And most of the time, I think we can forgive people in those situations. But there's usually one or two situations in which we can't forgive. Just like Don Corleone said, if his son were struck by lightning, he couldn't forgive that, but he could forgive everything else. And most of the time, in these situations, we're just too comfortable with our unforgiveness. We have a sense of righteous anger that actually feels a little good because we think, oh, we're in the right. We're saying to ourselves, oh, yeah, pal, I'm not forgiving you for what you did. You know what you did. Most of the time we're saying this to ourselves, and the other person has no idea that we're not forgiving them. But righteous anger is sort of like an itch that you have to scratch. What happens when you scratch an itch? Feels better. For about, 30 seconds? And then what do? Scratch again. And maybe you have to scratch several times, and that scratching causes you to break the skin and bleed. But what if instead you put some soothing lotion on that itch before you started to scratch? Well, forgiveness is the salve that soothes the anger of unforgiveness. Mandela was able to not only liberate his people when he did what he did, but he was also able to liberate himself, which is probably why you always see Mandela smiling in all the pictures. I mean, I can't think of a picture in which Mandela wasn't smiling. Did you ever see Vladimir Putin smile? Forgiveness? You must be joking, comrade. We can liberate ourselves through forgiveness, but as I said, forgiveness is hard. In his book, excuse me, Authentic Happiness, which I may have mentioned here once before, it's one of my favorite books, written by Martin Seligman, who is a professor of psychology at University of Pennsylvania. Just like Worthington studies forgiveness, Seligman studies happiness. And he writes, the human brain has evolved to ensure that our firefighting negative emotions will trump the broadening, building, and abiding, but very fragile, positive emotions. The only way out of this emotional wilderness is to change your thoughts by rewriting your past, forgiving, forgetting, or suppressing bad memories. Now, the problem, Seligman says, with suppressing bad memories is they can sort of boomerang on you. Sort of like trying to forget something very hard, but it makes you actually remember that. So you're trying not to think about something that's coming up, and you're thinking about it all the time. But the thing is, you don't want to forget situations in which you were hurt and would require forgiveness. For the simple reason is you don't want it to happen again. So forgetting is not the issue. Forgiving is the issue. And you want to take the anger out of that remembering. And Seligman says that, excuse me, by forgiving, it leaves the memory intact, but removes and even transforms the sting. Sort of like a broken bone that gets healed and becomes stronger after it's healed than what it was like before. we have a hard time forgiving because we think of ourselves, Americans in particular, as being fair people. We're big on fairness, although Lord knows there are many instances of unfairness in our society, that 1% that we talk about all the time. But we see things more than other societies in black and white, whereas the world is really more in many shades of gray. And so when fairness is violated, we want to punish the person who was responsible for that violation. It's also a problem for us to forgive because we think of forgiving as being nice to the other person. And we want to know who's going to be nice to us. Well, the reality is that forgiveness is being nice to us because it takes away that anger and that stops that unforgiveness itch that I mentioned earlier. Seligman says, you can't hurt the perpetrator by not forgiving, but you can set yourself free by forgiving. Setting yourself free not only helps you psychologically and spiritually and emotionally, but it helps you physically. Seligman says physical health, particularly in cardiovascular terms, is likely better in those who forgive than those who do not. And those benefits extend further if you reach some kind of reconciliation the way Mandela did with his Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So, let's assume that you're willing to forgive, but you don't know how to go about it. Well, Mr. Worthington, the author of the book that I read from, has a program with the acronym REACH that he talks about in the book, but he also uses it in workshops across the country. And the R in REACH stands for remembering, again, because you don't want to forget, but also you want to remember in a way that takes away the sting, that looks at the situation without malicious content. E is for empathize, which is hard to do when you're talking about somebody who has wronged you in some fashion. But by empathizing, you're really looking at why the person did what he or she did. And in many cases, that person had no intent to harm. Sometimes a person just lashes out in anger for one reason or another. I've done that more than a few times myself. The A in REACH stands for altruistic gift. And it means thinking of forgiving the other person as a gift to them. Now, that may be difficult. One way to help you to remember that is to think of a situation in which somebody else gave you that gift. And I'm sure we've all been in situations in which somebody forgave us. Now, the key here with this altruistic gift is to do it without strings attached. You can't say, okay, I'm going to forgive you, but I still hate your guts. You don't have to like the person necessarily, but you can't still harbor that antipathy. The C is to commit publicly. And by that, Worthington mentions writing it down on paper, maybe a letter to that person saying, I forgive you and this is why. And there's something about writing down something as a writer, this is something that I feel all the time, that gets it out of your system and makes it more real. Now, even though he talks about committing publicly, you don't necessarily have to show that letter to the other person, but writing it down in and of itself is helpful. Several months ago, I read a story in the Wall Street Journal about the coach of the Cleveland Browns football team who issued iPads to all his players so they could keep up with the increasingly technical and complex systems that are in professional football. But he also gave them a pad and a pencil or a pen because he wanted them to write things down as well, because he knew as a teacher in his former life that writing things down was important in terms of how we learn. And the H in reach is to hold on to that forgiveness, to, again, not forget that what a person did, but not to attach any anger to it. We don't want to forget what happened, but we also don't want to dwell on it. Now, I have to admit that Worthington's breach sounded a bit mushy until I read that there was a study done at Stanford of 259 adults. I have no idea why it was 259 and not 260. Maybe somebody dropped out. And they had one group that took this, I think it was an 8-hour workshop based on reach, and another group that didn't. And the forgiveness workshop group reported substantial effects of less anger, less stress, more optimism, and better health. And Seligman responds by saying, learning how to forgive past wrongs diffuses the bitterness that makes life satisfaction impossible. Satisfaction is another way of saying happiness, and as I mentioned, he's a professor of happiness. And one of the things he talks about in his book is trying to exchange negative emotions, like the emotions we have when we're angry and need to forgive someone, with positive emotions. And in doing so, we can make our happiness much more possible. Now, while forgiving is hard, so is asking for forgiveness. One reason why asking for forgiveness is hard is because we may not think we need forgiveness. I didn't do anything wrong. Why do I need forgiveness? Another reason is that if we ask someone for forgiveness, we worry that they may not forgive us. And it's hard enough to ask someone for forgiveness, but if they say, I'm not ready to forgive you, that really makes it very difficult. Now, finally, just because I'm standing here talking about forgiveness doesn't mean that I have it locked up as a concept, that I always know when to forgive and I always do the right thing. I struggle with forgiveness just as everybody else does. But as long as I'm wearing this bracelet and asking, what would Mandela do, I think my chances of forgiving are much better. May it be so. Amen and thank you.